Good afternoon. It is good to see everybody. We're going to wait a few seconds as people trickle into the webinar today, but we're really excited to have you. My name is Kyle Strickland. I'm the Deputy Director of Race and Democracy at the Roosevelt Institute and Senior Legal Analyst at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. And today, my role is co-president of ACS Columbus. Really excited to have you. This program is brought to you by the American Constitution Society, the country's foremost progressive legal organization with more than 200 student and lawyer chapters across the nation. ACS is actually celebrating its 20th anniversary this year of shaping national legal debates, nurturing the next generation of lawyers, judges, and advocates, and ensuring that the law is a force for improving the lives of all people. We are focused on our work in this anniversary year on our Constitution's founding failures when it comes to race and equality in this country and reckoning with our past to create a more just and equitable future. And if you don't already, we encourage you to follow ACS on social media, including on Twitter at ACS Law, and you can also find them online at acslaw.org. And there you can join ACS as well as find out more information about upcoming events and opportunities. So today's event couldn't come at a more timely moment. With so much going on with the COVID-19 pandemic, with racial injustice and growing inequality in our country, we have to have conversations about the future of our democracy, including the filibuster and other democracy reforms. So our event is brought to you by ACS Columbus in co-sponsorship with ACS Austin, Chicago, Colorado, Connecticut, DC, Houston, Los Angeles, Madison, New York, Northeast Ohio, Tampa, and Western New York lawyer chapters. So we're really excited for this conversation with ACS President and former Senator Russ Feingold on the future of the filibuster. So before further ado, I want to hand it over to co-president Sarah Pomeroy, who's going to introduce herself as well as introduce the senator. Sarah?
Thank you so much, Kyle. And hello to everybody. We're really happy to have you here. My name is Sarah Pomeroy. I am, as Kyle said, the co-president of the American Constitution Society. I am an assistant city attorney with the city of Columbus, specifically focusing on public nuisances, quality of life issues, including deteriorating housing, absentee landlords, crime-ridden hotels, liquor law violations in the city of Columbus. I have the honor today of introducing Senator Russ Feingold, former senator from Wisconsin and current president of ACS. During his 18 years in the U.S. Senate, Senator Feingold was ranked 6th in the Senate for bipartisan voting, most notably co-sponsoring a law that we all know, Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act, i.e. the McCain-Feingold Act, the only major piece of campaign finance legislation passed into law in the last few decades. He has served on the Judiciary, Foreign Relations, Budget, and Intelligence Committees, including chairmanship of the Constitution Subcommittee. Since leaving the Senate in 2011, he has taught extensively at various U.S. law schools, taught foreign policy to graduate and undergrad students, played a significant mentoring role to students throughout the U.S. He contributes regularly to various publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, in addition to frequent MSNBC and CNN news appearances. We're honored to have him here today to discuss what I think is arguably the most important procedural issue we've all faced in a long time. So without further ado, I'll toss it over to the Senator.
Thank you very much. And of course, congratulations to the ACS Columbus lawyer chapter for putting this together, and specifically Kyle and Sarah for your leadership, and to all the attendees, the co-sponsoring chapters. And I want to particularly congratulate Kyle. I understand you were recently appointed to Columbus's new Civilian Police Review Board. So that is very important, marvelous work, and so glad you have such strong co-chairs here. Yeah, I'm Russ Feingold. I'm from Wisconsin, Badger fan, and a very controversial thing to say on this call. But, family's been here for over 100 years, but I went to law school, of course, but I became, after a few years in practice, I became a political guy at the state Senate for 10 years, U.S. Senate for 18 years, as you mentioned. I just feel very lucky to be working at an organization that sort of blends interesting legal things with interesting political issues and activist issues. So it's a pleasure. With regard to the filibuster, obviously it is a Senate rule that empowers a minority of senators to obstruct the will of a majority of senators. That's it. It's not mentioned in the Constitution in any way, shape, or form. nor is it even a philosophical or foundational tenet of the Senate itself. If you look at the early years of the Senate, you will not see any reference to something like this. It actually was almost a fluke, the way that it came to be. In almost every parliamentary body in the world, including the House of Representatives in the United States, and I think all your state legislatures, if there's a debate going on, a normal motion under Robert's Rules of Order is to say, Mr. President or Madam President, I call the previous question. And what that means is that if they have a vote, and if a majority, just a majority, say we're done listening to you guys, we want to vote, that's it. You go to a vote. But somehow in the US Senate, and this occurred amazingly enough, by the rulings of two people you've heard of. They were both vice president when they made these rulings, so presiding over the Senate. One was a guy you might have heard of, Thomas Jefferson. The other one was a guy you might have heard of, Aaron Burr. And they both ruled, not in any sort of an aggressive way. They said, you know, you shouldn't do that. We should only have a motion for a previous question in very narrow circumstances. So the stage was set for unlimited debate with no way to cut it off, but it really didn't become an issue or a problem in a significant way for many, many years. Some would say for 100 years. But as we know, if the filibuster is used to block legislation essential to the functioning of our democracy, which I think many of us think might be happening now, including on voting rights, police reform, campaign finance reform, and redistricting, even though I have not in the past said, let's just get rid of the filibuster, I think at a minimum, it has to be reformed and it has to be reconsidered. Let me also say, if I could, just for a minute to get a couple of these points out. You know, some people say, well, the filibuster, you got to have it so that there'll be bipartisanship. That is a red herring. There is no bipartisan inducing power to the number 60. Today's near extinction of bipartisanship is caused by hyperpartisanship, not Senate procedure. And if you like to ask me about the way McCain-Feingold happened, it happened over the course of 8 years, not because of the filibuster, but in spite of the filibuster. We had to fight the filibuster, and we did it in a bipartisan way. Arguments in defense of the filibuster today are really not about bipartisanship or Senate tradition. What they really are is about retaining the ability to obstruct the will of a majority of senators. You know that majority of senators represent a huge percentage of the American people, except for in this circumstance. The filibuster, as you know, has been reformed multiple times. By no means has it always been in the same form, including as recently as 2017, when Senator Mitch McConnell eliminated it for Supreme Court justices. And of course, Harry Reid, the Democratic leader in 2013, had already eliminated it, sort of half of the whole filibuster for all nominations other than the Supreme Court, all appellate and district judges, as well as all other nominations. So half of it's already gone. The legislative part is still there. Right now, there are GOP controlled state legislatures, as you know, that are pursuing hundreds of voter suppression bills that are antithetical to democracy. And Senator Warnock said it best from Georgia on the Senate floor. I can't say it as well as he did, but there's just no moral equivalence between retaining the filibuster and protecting voting rights. We have to protect voting if we care about our democracy. The reality is that filibuster was one of those things that helped perpetuate Jim Crow. It was consistently used to defend segregation and, of course, to block civil rights legislation. So we have to think about this. We have to reckon with how the filibuster has thwarted legislation throughout history that was critical to our democratic legitimacy. And that's true especially today. So again, my view is, and we can talk about this in detail, that the filibuster should be reformed at a minimum so it cannot block legislation that is necessary for the functioning of our democracy, like protecting voting rights. So we hope that all of you will continue to engage on this issue after we've had our conversation today by, writing op-eds in your local papers. I mean, you'll be amazed. They would love to print them, at your local papers in Ohio or wherever you might be. They often will take these, and it's very helpful. and continue to generate discussions on this critical issue. If you're interested in speaking out on this, please contact us at ACS, at LCA Mails at acslaw.org. So again, thank you. And I'll be happy to now engage in whatever kind of conversation you'd like to have about this.
Of course. Well, thank you so much for that opening, Senator. And of course, for those participating, feel free. We've got the Q&A chat box. All of you should be used to Q&A by now with all the Zooms that you've done. So feel free to pop any Q&A in the chat box, and we'll get to that towards the end of the discussion. First kind of opening question that I'll have for you, Senator, really is around, you mentioned this conversation about, at the very least, reform the filibuster. What are your thoughts on some of the prospects as it relates to either reform or eliminating the filibuster, of course, given the makeup in the Senate right now?
Well, over the years, there have been repeated attempts to try to reform the current form of the filibuster. And an amazing fact is that this whole idea of a filibuster where nobody really talks, where it doesn't look anything like Mr. Smith goes to Washington and going as long as you can go and collapsing on the Senate floor. That really sort of ended in 1975 when a very well-intentioned Democrat Majority Leader, Mike Mansfield, very mild-mannered guy from Montana, said, why don't we do this? Why don't we if there's a bill being filibustered, we'll take it up in the morning, and then we'll take another bill up in the afternoon. So that it was an idea to try to keep things moving, but it somehow collapsed into a system where the people that are supposed to be keeping the filibuster going in the morning don't have to even do anything. They just email the majority leader and say, by the way, I'm still filibustering. So all of us, as the partisanship grew in recent years, and that was actually after I came to the Senate when I really saw this happening, all of a sudden, like a huge percentage of the bills are being filibustered. When I first got there, we'd hear that somebody was been a filibuster, it was kind of exciting. We didn't, it was like one guy, like Harry Reid, he was mad because he didn't want a nuclear repository in Yucca Mountain in Nevada. So, he gets up there and talks for 8 hours. And it's kind of fun because you're done. You don't have to do your other work, and this is going on. But it was nothing. It was like a real physical effort to do that. So in answer to your question, at a minimum, we have to get rid of this silent filibuster. We have to make it that you have to actually talk if you're going to do this. Now, there are many other possibilities. Senator Tom Harkin, the former senator from Iowa, would always propose a descending order process. And that's how the way this would have worked is maybe during the first 2 weeks of bills up, you need 60 votes to stop the filibuster. But then he proposed a sliding scale that after 2 weeks, it goes down to 55, then 53, then 52, 51. So there are all kinds of academics, all kinds of people proposing ideas. I had a couple of professors from Harvard call me the other day, and we got on the phone for an hour. And they said, we have an idea of making it so that the filibuster can only be maintained based on the population of the states of the objecting senators, which, is kind of edgy, but, so there's all kinds of creative thinking. So I can elaborate more, but one other point. Changes don't have to be permanent. And this is where I'm kind of being edgy. People kind of think, well, either we get rid of this thing or we change it for 50 years. It doesn't have to be. You can have a 2-year temporary rule to allow voting rights legislation to not be covered by the filibuster. You can you can add a statute to make another exception to the filibuster as we have for the healthcare bill and others. You can do that. And if you're saying, well, we shouldn't do it forever, maybe have it expire in a couple of years. So anyway, there's a lot of ways to do it.
Thank you, Senator. That's really interesting. And I think building off of that, thinking back to your experience in the Senate, you mentioned at the top that people think that it fosters bipartisanship, but in reality, I think you've certainly put out there that it does not. And I'm wondering could you talk about how some of those reforms might have worked differently back in your day? Like, would you have been able to get McCain-Feingold even faster? Just talk a little bit about how it could have been different for you during your experience.
No, there's no question that it would have been faster. And again, in those days, I didn't believe in getting rid of the filibuster. Let me tell you one story on that side of it, to be fair and balanced, to use an expression. But then the other side of it. So when I came to the Senate, just before McCain and I started working together on campaign finance, one day, my hero, I couldn't believe I was serving with him. Senator Ted Kennedy had his people call the office and say, come down here, get Feingold down here. We need him to speak on this bill. And the bill was a bill to get rid of the Davis-Bacon protections for wages for workers. And we were in the minority because of the contract with America. So I get out there and he said, well, we have Mr. Feingold here. He's one of our new senators. And I spoke for about 5 minutes. And then I sat down. And he looks at me and he goes, keep talking, because we don't care what you're saying, Russ. This is a filibuster. Just talk. Well, guess what? Because we were able to because they needed 60 votes, we did prevent key environmental and labor laws from being repealed. So that's one side of the coin. But the other side of the coin is what you asked about McCain-Feingold. So we had 50 votes almost, within a couple of years, but it took us 8 years. And John and I knew that we had to get 60 votes. So the way we did it was bipartisan, which was he and I, of course, Republican and Democrat. Whenever a new person would say they wanted to help us, let's say it was a Democrat, our rule was you had to then have a Republican join them. I called it, the animals go 2 by 2. So by the time we had 10 senators, we basically could control the body in terms of guaranteeing that we would get a vote. But we kept getting beat every year until we finally got the 60th vote. And it did take way too long for something of that magnitude. Sometimes people say, well, we should have it for judges. You can hear that argument. It's not crazy that if you're going to put people on the bench who are going to supposedly be fair to everybody, that it would be better if it was a bipartisan, big margin. But that's not the way the right's playing the game. They're playing the game to make sure that nobody who's reasonable, let alone liberal, gets on the court. So you really have to say, well, is there any reality to that? But no, it is certainly not the case that the filibuster is a regular assist in terms of bipartisanship, and it does definitely slow things down. And we're seeing it every day right now. The infrastructure bill, voting rights, whatever it might be, let alone some of the other bills that might come up.
Well, thank you for that. And as you mentioned, really this idea of bipartisanship, this idea, there's a lot of misconceptions about what the filibuster is and what it isn't, right? And we know, obviously more and more has been uncovered about the fact that there's been a long history of the Senate using the filibuster to block civil rights legislation, voting rights legislation. Today, we're facing that same prospect right now when we know that this will disproportionately affect communities of color, as well as issues around voting rights and racial justice without some reform, with all of what we're seeing with voter suppression efforts all across the country. If there's no reform, tell us what's at stake for the future of our democracy if we do not reform or eliminate the filibuster or implement some other reforms moving forward.
Well, if the current form of the filibuster is able to kill all the things you were just talking about, this isn't just any time. And frankly, when John McCain and I were pushing our bill, it was important, but it wasn't anything like what we're going through now, where the very legitimacy of our democracy is in question for people on both the left and the right. We know from January 6th and all the horrors from the right that a lot of people have convinced themselves that our government is not on the level and that it requires the most extreme responses. And so it's a delegitimizing there. Also on the left, let's face it, an awful lot of people, progressives, diverse groups of people in our country question the legitimacy of our government, especially through its police powers and its ability to make people miserable or kill them or whatever, using the power of the state without real good rules or real reform of policing. And so that's delegitimizing. So if you can't get legislation through that would make sure that people feel comfortable voting, that's foundational. And the same thing, in my view, is for getting the kind of ethics and campaign finance reform that is in HR 1. And I also think given what's going on with Derek Chauvin and all these incidents, that police reform needs to be done. And so for the filibuster to prevent those sorts of things from happening, it's not just, well, we'll come back 2 years from now. We're at a terrible flashpoint We're waiting, obviously, to see what this verdict will be. Incredibly worried. I lived through the period of the riots in the 60s and the night Martin Luther King was killed. I remember it well. And then seeing the reaction all over the country, including in Milwaukee, I'm really worried that unless there is some belief that we can make these reforms and make them soon, that it is going to be very hard for people to feel that the federal government and even the Biden administration and even the Democratic majority in both houses, that it is on the level. It is a time of a dire need for action.
Thank you for that, Sarah.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think this brings up an interesting point, and it's actually reflected in a couple of our questions that we've gotten. So, proponents of the filibuster will express concerns over the impact of no filibuster, when progressive lawmakers are in the minority. I think that there's an argument to be had that the filibuster resulted in keeping the Affordable Care Act, a few years ago. And so I'm interested how you would react to those possibilities when there's a progressive minority. Is this a matter of potential short-term gains to pass important legislation versus that long-term impact on governing and that long-term impact of relationships in the Senate?
Yeah, I mean, that is a risk, but you have to really assess the nature of the relationships. When I was in the Senate in the early years, they were genuine relationships. People would not even consider using the filibuster the way it's been used now. And so people will say, well, if you change these filibuster rules for voting rights and the infrastructure bill and HR 1, Mitch McConnell is just going to come back in a couple of years and do terrible things once they take over the Senate, which they might. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but my answer is he'll do it anyway. And I would not have said that even about him a few years ago. He proved it when he stole the Supreme Court. He proved he was willing to do anything. First, completely ignoring President Obama's right to fill Scalia's seat. Second, disrespectfully and really cravenly filling Justice Ginsburg's seat. He would have no compunction about doing this anyway. So how do you solve this problem of a lack of collegiality and respect? Somehow the norms have to come back. But for us to not act at this critical historic moment, to try to solve these problems because we're afraid of what Mitch is going to do, I no longer believe in it. I think in the past I might have, but I think people have to act now. Take our chances on the future.
And as a follow-up to that, I mean, what are your thoughts on, let's say there is a reform or elimination of the filibuster. What do you think about the sustainability of legislation moving forward? Let's say if Democrats or progressives are in the minority, what are your thoughts on that? Because that's been an argument as well. Well, even if we get something done, we're going to see things rolled back. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, it's true that there is a risk that the progress could be undone, but it's not easy. And obviously the Republicans have bashed their heads against the wall trying to kill the Affordable Care Act, as you mentioned. Now, it's lucky that John McCain was around at a critical moment, but there's a lot of different ways that can happen. You can have a Democratic president. It's like you can keep that going. That takes care of a lot of things. You can flip the House. Let's say we lose the House and the Senate. And I shouldn't say we. ACS does not take sides. Let's say the Democrats. I'll pretend I'm a Democrat right now. Let's say the Democrats lose both houses, and then these things start happening. But Biden's still president. Well, maybe Biden loses or the Democrat loses, but maybe the House flips back again. And so the traps that you have to run to undo something like that is very difficult. And so again, because of the different ways in which you can prevent that sort of thing, it is important that we not be intimidated by what possibly would happen to such legislation in the future. And if it gets repealed, okay, so be it, it happened. But, I'd say it's better to take the chance on that than to never get the voting rights.
Yeah, excellent point. And I'm curious because, when I think when the general public thinks about Congress, thinks about the Senate, I think obstructionism sometimes comes to mind. And I think I'm curious your thoughts on, does reforming the filibuster actually help to address obstructionism? Does it help to eliminate it? Because, if you think about, you've got potential senators on the margins saying, this is going to pass because they've got 51 to 49. So maybe I'm going to try and get something for my folks in here. And does that actually end up, ironically, flipping that argument on bipartisanship?
Yeah, I mean, it can work badly the other way. I mean, there's people out there now, John and McCain and I were leaders in getting rid of earmarks. And now they're saying, wow, we need to bring those back. Sort of like the grease that kept the process moving. No, it wasn't. It was a corrupt, disgusting process. And so you'd have legislation passed, not because somebody believed in it, but because they got a bridge for Tulsa, Oklahoma or something. And so, that kind of thing. And that, frankly, was part of how we got the healthcare bill. Remember, the Louisiana Purchase and the Cornhusker provision and all that. It's not pretty, though. The cliche about legislation. It's like it's like sausage. You don't want to see it being made, kind of thing. There is that element of it. But I don't think eliminating or modifying the filibuster will fundamentally change that aspect of the system.
That's great. You got to be thinking right now what's going on in Leader Schumer's mind of thinking through, you've got to get this caucus together all on board with something in order to get all these major pieces passed. What are your thoughts on some of the specific components? You mentioned a little bit about some of the Senate rules, but for those who are unfamiliar, how would you implement some of those moving forward? And would you need those 51 votes to move ahead? What does that look like in terms of some of those specifics that they could implement?
Yeah. So the key thing about I mentioned the filibuster is not in the Constitution. In fact, it's not even mentioned in the Senate rules. And it wasn't even an issue until about World War I, to the point where people felt they should do something about it. So Woodrow Wilson was upset with a bunch of progressive senators who didn't want us to go into World War I in 1917, led by Fighting Bob La Follette. I'm pointing to his poster up here behind me. But Wilson was furious and said that these were 11 willful men. We got to deal with it. So they passed a rule for the first time in the history of the Senate. There had never been any limitation on debate. Rule 22, a provision in Rule 22 says, if people want to cut off debate and move forward, that they have to get, and at the time I think it was 2/3. It wasn't even 60. So this has changed a number of times. So it's done through the rules, and an interesting aspect of our Constitution. And the reason why it's very hard, if not impossible, to get to the Supreme Court to intervene in this is the Constitution expressly grants to each house of the Congress the right to set its own rules. So these rules are protected by, political question doctrine that obviously many of you encountered when you took constitutional law. So how do you change it? Well, there is a general assumption that unless the rules are changed at the beginning of a Congress, at the beginning of 2 years, there's one legislative day when you can do it by majority vote. But if you don't do it at that time, then the rule is you need a supermajority to change the rules. And that's very hard to do. Until the Republicans started talking in the mid-2000s. They were mad because they couldn't get a bunch of Bush's judges through. They started doing something that we called the nuclear option. And the nuclear option basically says, well, you can have all these rules you want, but if you got 51 senators saying, we want to change it, you can do it. It breaks a norm, it breaks a tradition, but it's not like something that the Supreme Court can say, hey, wait a minute, you can't do that. And so this is what's been done. Harry Reid used the nuclear option to get rid of the filibuster for nominations, and it was done by McConnell for purposes of the Supreme Court. If the decision was made by Schumer to do this, he could do it. He could change the rule, but he would have to have every Democrat on board, and no Republican's going to vote for it. But it's a power play. But And again, it can either be temporary or a permanent change in the rule. But that's how it's done. It's just done by a motion, and the majority leader can pull it off if he's got all the votes.
I have a question. So we've talked a little bit about the specific issues that getting rid of the filibuster, reforming it would address. Is there any strategy, or you think in your mind coherent way to distinguish between which types of issues you might want to make subject to the filibuster versus not? I'm curious your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I would hope there would be some thinking about things. I mean, it's always hard to say that one issue is more important than another, but the idea of things that are fundamental to the functioning and legitimacy of our democracy, things like voting rights, should be in any kind of package that would be an exception to the filibuster. Let's say you don't want to eliminate the filibuster. Maybe other things wouldn't be in there. Maybe infrastructure wouldn't be. I mean, I really think we desperately need infrastructure. But, turning that into something that can't be filibustered, not necessarily. In other words, those things that undermine the very idea of our system, I think you can make a better argument should be exempted from the filibuster. So I would make that contrast.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, I think to that point, there's a question in the chat here about, you haven't always opposed the filibuster. And so was there a particular moment that really got you saying, hey, we need to reform the filibuster moving forward? Can you think back to a particular moment that has kind of galvanized you to this point?
Yeah. So actually, Chuck Schumer used to think we ought to get rid of the filibuster, and I used to tell him I wouldn't do it. That this was a different era when I was concerned about progressive laws. I would say the recent events in this country, the denying the results of an election, the police brutality, the horrible anti-voting laws have made me realize that, as Warnock said, he said, the idea you're going to protect the rights of the minority in the Senate, but not the rights of minorities in the country really doesn't make a lot of sense. And so that's been persuasive. But I want to be clear, I didn't always think that the idea of having a filibuster is a bad idea. I have to share the fact that I once did a filibuster that, believe it or not, was somewhat humorous. It was for the Wisconsin dairy industry. As you know, we are cheeseheads here, and at least traditionally, nothing's been more important. So there's a milk marketing order system from the 1930s that gives more reimbursement to dairy farmers in Wisconsin than other places in the country for various reasons, and we wanted to protect it. Well, my arch enemies here were two mean senators. One was named Pat Leahy and one was named Bernie Sanders. They were the two senators from Vermont, of course, close allies. But Vermont and Wisconsin you can look in the Agriculture Committee records that he and I had an argument about which state had better ice cream. So Leahy's on the Appropriations Committee, and he gets Senator Mikulski of Maryland to stick in a provision on a bill that has to pass. It has nothing to do with the housing bill that's going to take away our reimbursement for our farmers. So I said to my staff, get me some stuff to do a filibuster. All of a sudden, they come out to the Senate floor with a big pile of the history of cheese recipe books. And I got up there and I was sort of straight about it for a while. And then I kept a straight face, but I started reading cheese recipes. I talked about how Camembert was the queen of cheese, how the ancient Egyptians really liked cheese. And so this kept going on. And, if you knew who Senator Mikulski was, she was the toughest person in the Senate. You didn't want to mess with her if you didn't have to. She kind of got mad and she said, Mr. President, could I ask the senator from Wisconsin when he's going to stop talking about this stuff? And I said, Mr. President, say to the senator from Maryland, I will stop as soon as this damn provision is taken out of the bill. And they took it out because they didn't want to sit around and do it all day. But, to me, that idea of a moment when you stand up and you stand up for your state, when the rest of the Senate might not understand it, I thought that was fine. And it didn't happen that often. But you asked the question, what changed me? Well, when people can't even get water when they're voting, okay, the line has to be drawn. And so it really has been recently that I feel that strongly about it.
And I wonder if you could think back to, as you've changed on thinking about the filibuster reform, there's a question in the chat asking for, any commentary on how the filibuster resulted in potentially other reforms that folks wanted to make, specifically no public option in the Affordable Care Act. You can think through any number of laws that had the filibuster not been a necessity. What else could we as progressives potentially try to do? I wonder if you want to comment that, if there's anything thinking back that we would love to have added.
Sure. That's a really good example, the Affordable Care Act, because you may or may not remember that initially it passed the Senate and it was a regular bill. And we had to get 60 votes. And because we had to get 60 votes, and here Bernie and I were friends. Bernie and I were the leading advocates for a public option. But we needed 60 votes. So we needed Joe Lieberman. We needed Ben Nelson to support it. And even though we came close, they wouldn't do it. And the only reason, of course, the legislation was ultimately passed is that they figured out a way to start it in the House again using the statutory authority under the Budget Act that only requires a majority vote and then coming back to the Senate that way. But no, there were lost opportunities in terms of that bill. The same thing for McCain-Feingold. There were other reforms that we would have loved to have had, such as public financing of elections and other reforms that we just knew we might get 51 votes for it, but not 60. So no, you do have to, and John and I got along extremely well, but the biggest argument we ever had was about trimming some stuff out of the bill that I didn't get rid of. And he goes, Russ, he was 16 years older than I, so I had to kind of, defer to him, and he was a military guy. But he said, Russ, you gotta give on this, or we're gonna get nothing. It was one of those moments. It was because of the filibuster.
Yeah, and you speak to trying to be able to kind of get these moments across, get these bills across. What do you think in terms of some of the timing we have here right now? We're entering summer 2021. How critical do you think the timing is for some rules to be changed on this? Obviously, given the midterms coming up and so much, you've got debates that are happening right now around infrastructure. What do you think about timing and how important this is?
Well, it's just absolutely critical. I mean, it's hard to talk about it, but the truth is this entire opportunity hangs by a heartbeat, literally. If we somehow lost one senator on one of the sides, the Democratic side, depending on how that person would be replaced, that's it. And there's no opportunity. And the same thing goes for the judges, putting judges through. So, I've talked to a couple of my former colleagues who are very worried about moving things. And Sarah's right. I mean, you might get rid of this filibuster, but there are other delay tactics. So if they don't get going pretty soon, if Schumer doesn't test it pretty soon to find out whether they're going to be reasonable, something could happen. We're getting, believe it or not, we're already heading toward summer. We're heading toward, recesses. We're heading toward a supercharged political environment, which occurs in, then they'll start saying, well, it's an election year. You can't do it now. So the timing is so delicate. I've never seen anything like it. With this much at stake and everything coming down to this miracle that occurred that things could actually go a certain way with the voter turnout in Georgia. I mean, that was not, in many people's views, likely, but everything really hangs by a thread here.
Yeah, and I think along those timings, I'm curious your thoughts also, and not only timing with just the Senate calendar, but timing with what is the most pressing issues happening right now. I think among the discussion in filibuster reform is picking which issues. But I mean, it's no secret that there have been a huge number of mass shootings in the last week or so. And I mean, that for me that's a salient issue right now. Therefore, maybe we should change the rules to address that. Is that something that plays into the timing too, or is that hand in hand with the actual procedural timing with the Senate's calendar?
I mean, it's hard to look at something like that and not feel the same way. The challenge here is, let's say you just say, no, we're just going to do it for voting rights. All right, that's going to be your priority. But if you, and I've talked about several things that might be included, you've talked about several things, they have to go in a certain order. And the most precious commodity in the Senate is schedule time. And so that, and I was talking to the president's chief of staff the other day about schedule time, because he and I work together in the Senate. You know, anything that can allow 2 or 3 legislative days to be used up with some kind of a procedural tactic means that, you know, you getting to all these things would be very difficult. So what order do you put them in? I'm glad I don't have to decide because, you know, it's like choosing between your children. You know, it's very difficult, but how can you not look at these mass shootings and not want it to be extremely high on the list?
Yeah, it's tough. And especially, you know, you're hearing different approaches right now. So obviously, there's now the process through reconciliation. We also saw what happened with this past package where minimum wage, for example, was not considered within the rules because of the Byrd rule. You know, now you're seeing kind of this push. Well, you know, if we can't change the filibuster, maybe we'll get things done through reconciliation. Is there a worry that you might have in terms of if that's the approach that progressives take moving forward, just to go, hey, let's just try to get things done through reconciliation without ultimately dealing with things like the filibuster or other democracy reforms?
Yeah, I mean, and I don't know, I can't say that I'm for this, but if you use reconciliation for so many other things, change the statute, you would in effect get rid of the filibuster. I mean, you already have the budget, a lot of issues going to reconciliation under the current rules, trade agreements and fast track as majority vote by statute. If you're able to get that through, which, you know, would probably require changing the filibuster to change that rule. But if you did that, you would sort of effectively, if you went very far, get rid of the filibuster that way. And again, as Sarah said, you know, that could be, or you guys said it, that could be reversed later. But yeah, you have to just know what you're doing. You have to say, look, I really believe we shouldn't have the filibuster at all, because if you make the reconciliation so open, you've just turned it into a majority body, which a lot of people would believe in, but it would be one way to do it. You can do it by statute. But you can't do it just through the rules without doing the nuclear option.
And I think building on that, I wonder if we could talk for a few minutes about, okay, absent reforming the filibuster or getting rid of the filibuster, are there other democracy reforms that we should be looking at, whether it's at the congressional level or the states? You know, I think there's pushes certainly to increase the number of senators for popular states. I know that's a long-term reform, or to increase the number of Supreme Court justices and how that could potentially snowball into other effects on democracy. So curious what other reforms you think potentially we should be looking at beyond the filibuster?
Great question, because in a lot of ways, the filibuster is the easiest one to change. Chuck Schumer just has to get up with some morning and convince, 50 senators to do it. But you're talking about fundamental issues that, ACS's 20th anniversary is about reckoning with our Constitution. The fact that it has institutionalized a racial history that has been a catastrophe, and in many ways, for many people. And so it is time to look at things that probably require at least legislation, but maybe constitutional amendments. Getting rid of the Electoral College. It is just a relic. It doesn't make sense anymore. And a lot of people don't know, because I do teach a course on Article 5 and constitutional amendments. It came close to being eliminated in the 60s. Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana got a huge majority, huge bipartisan majority in the House to vote for constitutional amendment to get rid of it. Didn't get through the Senate, but it was fairly close. So in those days, this wasn't a Republican or Democrat thing. People were just like, this is stupid. Why wouldn't we have this? But now we have a very divided country. Yes, the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has been elevated to a status in this country that a lot of progressive legal scholars are candidly pointing out is way beyond what the founders intended, and really is so anti-democratic that it's disconcerting. This goes against what I was taught, what I believed. I was a Warren Court guy. So I thought, the Supreme Court is awesome. It's the best thing that ever happened. But that's a very small part of our history. The truth is it's now been captured by the right, stolen by the right. So we at ACS want serious consideration of real reforms, term limits for Supreme Court justices, adding the number of justices, possibly even the power to affect the jurisdiction of the court is well within the power of the Congress. So some of these things can be done by statute. Some of these things would possibly require constitutional amendment and would certainly be challenged. But that is an area that needs desperately needs reform. And, you know, I'm very interested in constitutional change. And I fear, and actually have done some writing on the possibility of a very far right constitutional convention. But one way or another, it seems to me that, you know, we don't have a right to vote in the Constitution. It's not there. And so creating a constitutional amendment that would actually be put in the Constitution to stop the kind of thing that happened in the Shelby County decision so that voting rights laws are protected. I mean, these are all foundational things that need to be done. And there's different ways that can happen.
And to that point about these different types of reform efforts, you know, what would you say to, obviously we've got a lot of progressive lawyers and others listening in on today's webinar, you know, that are, you know, that almost want to know, what can we do? You know, what is it that we can do? You mentioned a little bit at the top, but it's also a little bit about the different roles that people can play when it comes to these issues with the filibuster or other future democracy reforms.
Well, you're doing it right here. And I'm not just saying this. Bringing together these different chapters across the country to hear the same kind of message and then hopefully turn it into a couple of settings. One is, as I mentioned, op-eds in your local area, conveying some of these ideas. And we can help you with this. We even have one of the top professors train people in writing op-eds. It is really fun to have your op-ed as a law student or a young lawyer or a lawyer in the paper, and you should do that. The same thing goes for our students. You know, a lot of times you run into professors who have sort of taught this stuff the same old way, but if you have the confidence of knowing that you have the resources to make the argument about the filibuster and its history in a different way, it should be done in the classroom. This is what the right did. They started challenging what they considered to be the mantra of the left in the classrooms. Well, it is time for other ideas to be socialized and legitimized. And we do a lot of that through our issue briefs and the various things that ACS does. And do not hesitate. If any individual wants help in trying to formulate that kind of an approach, either in class, if it's a student or a lawyer who wants to do an op-ed, or more programs like this. This is, you know, COVID has been so horrible, but one thing that has happened is that our chapters realize they can connect with each other and do things in a way that is even more impactful, arguably, than it was in the past. So, and then I'm sure that my staff would want me to mention other things you can do, and perhaps they'll follow up, but those are a couple of things that come to mind.
Great. And we have a few minutes, so I'm gonna just jump to one of the questions that's in the chat. So, you know, we've talked about a few things, you know, the danger of potentially, if you don't have the filibuster, do things regress, do Republicans seek to, you know, undermine or dismantle, you know, really fundamental pieces of legislation. I mean, I think about the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, Title IX, you know, any number of administrative rules that have been put out there by either Biden or Obama, you know, so on and so forth. Are there other, let's say you do reform the filibuster, are there other protections we could put in place to make sure that these fundamental pieces of legislation, you know, still stay intact in the, you know, event that things do switch over?
Well, I mean, that's probably the best argument. And of course, my Kennedy anecdote is about this, for not completely eliminating the filibuster. And picking certain issues, putting a time frame on it. We call it sunsetting in legislative bodies, so that, you know, if in a couple of years or 3 or 4 years, it looks like things have been improved in that area, you don't need to, as you suggest, put in a vulnerable position a lot of progressive laws that have been fought for 100 years. So there is a way to do that. And of course, the hope would be is that somehow, if the Senate really wants to continue to be a deliberative body, or actually become a deliberative body again, and return to actual norms where you don't pull these stunts like the right has done, then there is an opportunity to say, all right, We know that we've had, like the, the wars in Ireland or whatever. We've had this period. Let's have a period of peace where we respect each other's views, and you can lock into the rules. You can entrench certain provisions that require a 2/3 vote to overturn, unless you use the nuclear option. So the norm that has to be developed again is that you really shouldn't use this nuclear option all the time, because then you can entrench certain practices and people won't be tempted to do this. But it's going to require the American people wanting to return to bipartisanship. When I was a young state senator candidate, everybody was like, they hated it if you talked about Republican versus Democrat. They'd slam the door in your face. And that's completely changed. Now people are like, if you're not, if you work with those Democrats or you work with those Republicans, you're a traitor. And, that's not because the congressmen and the senators wanted it that way. No way. It's because Fox News and social media and people out in the country have decided they want people at each other's throats. And they got to change their minds. They got to decide that they want a country that's at peace and that's trying to solve problems. And so in the end, it goes back to the people. And I'm not blaming the people. I'm just saying they're the sovereign. And if they want people to get along, believe me, politicians do what'll get them reelected. If they think getting along with the Democrats or the Republicans will get them reelected, they'll do it. If they think treating the other side like the enemy will get them reelected, they'll do it. It's not a very attractive image, but that's the truth. So it's up to the people to say, we want you to work together. Then the Senate could go back to a period where there was a sense of comity. That's what's missing.
Yeah, well, and I think you put it out there, it's up to the people. And, want to give you a couple minutes just to kind of, with closing remarks, really thinking about where we go from here. I mean, I think there's so much that's happening right now in our country, the COVID-19 pandemic, continued action we saw this week when it comes to mass shootings, police violence, racial injustice. So much is at stake in this country. What gives you hope in this moment? And what is it that, we can do as we move forward going to the summer and beyond?
Well, you can do a lot. You can do things both short-term and long-term. Look, it's almost miraculous, the different feeling in this country from a year ago with the change in leadership. It's unbelievable. And you gotta, as bad as things are, that's gotta feel good. Go for some victories now. Try to get some things done. Maybe they'll get undone. But the lesson of the Obamacare thing was that thing looked like it was going to be killed like 18 times. But once you get something through, and same thing with McCain-Feingold, they've damaged what we tried to accomplish by doing other things, but they've never been able to overturn it, even with the Supreme Court. So the fear that something like this might take a while shouldn't stop you from acting. Now, we are at a turning point in this country. I would also say you as younger lawyers are in that, some people say it's a Confucian expression. Some say it's a Scottish expression. May you live in interesting times. Apparently it is what was meant not as a blessing, but a curse. And you can look at it either way. But as young lawyers who have the skills and the knowledge to impact these things, it can be thrilling. Because you are acting at a critical moment in our nation's history. And so look at it that way. For some reason, it was destined that you would become lawyers, and you are a lawyer you are lawyers who are progressives at a moment when really critical things can happen. So you should try to enjoy it, even though it's hard stuff, but it's exciting.
Sarah?
Thank you. And thank you so much, Senator. I mean, this has been just an incredible discussion. I mean, I think we all recognize the time that we are in and the urgency of this moment across numerous issue areas. You've certainly given this whole community of progressive lawyers and progressive friends things to think about, ways we can activate, next steps. Certainly ACS is going to be a part of that, both at the national level, at the local chapter level, We really can't thank you enough for sharing your day with us. And before I start reading recipes, I'm going to toss it back to Kyle.
Of course, you don't want to filibuster us. No, no, we are no one. We're just so grateful, Senator, for you joining us today and having this conversation, and to all of you out there who have joined us for this conversation. Again, these are issues that we can all kind of work on, whether it's another ACS chapter putting together events and co-sponsoring around these issues. This is something that we want to do. Again, ultimately, this program was brought to you by ACS National, as well as all of our co-sponsoring chapters. This is the 20th anniversary of ACS, and we really have to be honest about the founding failures, as Senator Feingold mentioned, about not truly living up to our ideals in this country when it comes to race, equity, and justice. And we have the opportunity to do something about that now. So one of the things that you got to do is follow ACS on social media, as well as on Twitter at ACS Law. And then you can also research and look at more opportunities at acslaw.org. And there you can join ACS and find out more information. Here in Columbus, Ohio, for those of you joining us in Columbus, we have our ACS Columbus chapter here. And if you're in Ohio, the Northeast Ohio chapter co-sponsoring as well, we actually have pending CLE credits that we'll be able to send along. We'll make sure to follow up in an email with you all. But other than that, we're just really grateful, Senator, for you joining us today, having this conversation, and really encouraging all of us to move forward in this moment to address these critical issues at our time for our democracy. So with that, just want to say thank you so much on behalf of ACS Columbus, and on behalf of ACS National. Just want to say thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Senator.